"On the left, farther up," the officer told him, and added, "You can't miss it, Mr. Wharton. There's no other house near it." "You know me," said the DA. "Then you'll understand what I want you to do. I've agreed to go to that house alone. If they see you pass, they may think I'm not playing fair. So stop here." The man nodded and dismounted. "But," added the district attorney, as the car started forward again, "if you hear shots, I don't care how fast you come." The officer grinned. "Better let me trail along now," he called. "That's a tough joint." But Wharton motioned him back, and when again he turned to look, the man still stood where they had parted. 2 minutes later an empty taxicab came swiftly toward him, and, as it passed, the driver lifted his hand from the wheel and with his thumb motioned behind him. "That's one of the men," said Nolan, "that started with Mr. Rumson and Hewitt from Delmonico's." Wharton nodded, and, now assured that in their plan there had been no hitch, smiled with satisfaction. A moment later, when ahead of them on the asphalt road Nolan pointed out a spot of yellow, he recognized the signal and knew that within call were friends. The yellow cigarette box lay directly in front of a long wooden building of 2 stories. It was linked to the road by a curving driveway marked on either side by whitewashed stones. On verandas enclosed in glass, Wharton saw white-covered tables under red candle shades, and protruding from one end of the house and hung with electric lights and paper lanterns, a pavilion for dancing. In the rear of the house stood sheds and a thick tangle of trees on which the autumn leaves showed yellow. Painted fingers and arrows pointing and an electric sign proclaimed to all who passed that this was Kessler's. In spite of its reputation, the house wore the aspect of the commonplace. In evidence, nothing flaunted, nothing threatened. From a dozen other inns along the Pelham Parkway and the Boston Post Road it was in no way to be distinguished. As directed in the note, Wharton left the car in the road. "For 5 minutes stay where you are," he ordered Nolan. "Then go to the bar and get a drink. Don't talk to anyone, or they'll think you're trying to get information. Work around to the back of the house. Stand where I can see you from the window. I may want you to carry a message to Mr. Rumson." On foot, Wharton walked up the curving driveway, and if from the house his approach was spied upon, there was no evidence. In the second story the blinds were drawn, and on the first floor the verandas were empty. Nor, not even after he had mounted to the veranda and stepped inside the house, was there any sign that his visit was expected. He stood in the hall, and in front of him rose a broad flight of stairs that he guessed led to the private supper rooms. On his left was the restaurant. Swept and garnished after the revels of the night previous, and as though resting in preparation for those to come, it wore an air of peaceful inactivity. At a table a maitre d'hotel was composing the menu for the evening. Against the walls 3 colored waiters lounged sleepily, and on a platform at a piano a pale youth with drugged eyes was with one hand picking an accompaniment. As Wharton paused uncertainly, the young man, disdaining his audience, in a shrill nasal tenor raised his voice and sang, "And from the time the rooster calls I'll wear my overalls, and you a simple gingham gown. So if you're strong for a shower of rice, we 2 could make a paradise of any one-horse town." At sight of Wharton the head waiter reluctantly detached himself from his menu and rose. But before he could greet the visitor, Wharton heard his name spoken and, looking up, saw a woman descending the stairs. It was apparent that when young she had been beautiful, and, in spite of an expression in her eyes of hardness and distrust, which seemed habitual, she was still handsome. She was without a hat and wearing a house dress of decorous shades and in the extreme of fashion. Her black hair, built up in artificial waves, was heavy with brilliantine. Her hands, covered deep with rings, and of an unnatural white, showed the most fastidious care. But her complexion was her own, and her skin, free from paint and powder, glowed with that healthy pink that is supposed to be the perquisite only of the simple life and a conscience undisturbed. "I am Mrs. Earle," said the woman. "I wrote you that note. Will you please come this way?" That she did not suppose he might not come that way was obvious, for, as she spoke, she turned her back on him and mounted the stairs. After an instant of hesitation, Wharton followed. As well as his mind, his body was now acutely alive and vigilant. Both physically and mentally he moved on tiptoe. For whatever surprise, for whatever ambush might lie in wait, he was prepared. At the top of the stairs he found a wide hall along which on both sides were many doors. The one directly facing the stairs stood open. At one side of this the woman halted, and with a gesture of the jeweled fingers invited him to enter. "My sitting room," she said. As Wharton remained motionless, she substituted, "My office." Peering into the room, Wharton found it suited to both titles. He saw comfortable chairs, vases filled with autumn leaves, in silver frames photographs, and between two open windows a businesslike roller-top desk on which was a hand telephone. In plain sight through the windows he beheld the garage, and behind it the tops of trees. To summon Rumson, to keep in touch with Nolan, he need only step to one of these windows and beckon. The strategic position of the room appealed, and with a bow of the head he passed in front of his hostess and entered it. He continued to take note of his surroundings. He saw that from the office in which he stood doors led to rooms adjoining. These doors were shut, and he determined swiftly that before the interview began he must first know what lay behind them. Mrs. Earle had followed and, as she entered, closed the door. "No," said Wharton. It was the first time he had spoken. For an instant the woman hesitated, regarding him thoughtfully, and then, without resentment, pulled the door open. She came toward him swiftly, and he was conscious of the rustle of silk and the stirring of perfumes. At the open door she cast a frown of disapproval, and then, with her face close to his, spoke hurriedly in a whisper. "A man brought a girl here to lunch," she said. "They've been here before. The girl claims the man told her he was going to marry her. Last night she found out he has a wife already, and she came here today meaning to make trouble. She brought a gun. They were in the room at the far end of the hall. George, the waiter, heard the 2 shots and ran down here to get me. No one else heard. These rooms are fixed to keep out noise, and the piano was going. We broke in and found them on the floor. The man was shot through the shoulder, the girl through the body. His story is that after she fired, in trying to get the gun from her, she shot herself by accident. That's right, I guess. But the girl says they came here to die together, what the newspaper calls a suicide pact, because they couldn't marry, and that he first shot her, intending to kill her and then himself. That's silly. She framed it to get him. She missed him with a gun, so now she's trying to get him with this murder charge. I know her. If she'd been sober, she wouldn't have shot him. She'd have blackmailed him. She's that sort. I know her, and—" With an exclamation, the district attorney broke in upon her. "And the man," he demanded eagerly, "was it he killed Banff?" In amazement the woman stared. "Certainly not," she said. "Then what has this to do with Banff?" "Nothing." Her tone was annoyed, reproachful. "That was only to bring you here." His disappointment was so keen that it threatened to exhibit itself in anger. Recognizing this, before he spoke, Wharton forced himself to pause. Then he repeated her words quietly. "Bring me here?" he asked. "Why?" The woman exclaimed impatiently. "So you could beat the police to it," she whispered. "So you could hush it up." The surprised laugh of the man was quite real. It bore no resentment or pose. He was genuinely amused. Then the dignity of his office, tricked and insulted, demanded to be heard. He stared at her coldly. His indignation was apparent. "You have done extremely ill," he told her. "You know perfectly well you had no right to bring me up here, to drag me into a row in your roadhouse." "Hush it up," he exclaimed hotly. This time his laugh was contemptuous and threatening. "I'll show you how I'll hush it up." He moved quickly to the open window. "Stop!" commanded the woman. "You can't do that." She ran to the door. Again he was conscious of the rustle of silk, of the stirring of perfumes. He heard the key turn in the lock. It had come. It was a frame-up. There would be a scandal, and to save himself from it, they would force him to hush up this other one. But as to the outcome, in no way was he concerned. Through the window, standing directly below it, he had seen Nolan. In the sunlit yard, the chauffeur, his cap on the back of his head, his cigarette drooping from his lips, was tossing the remnants of the sandwich to a circle of excited hens. He presented a picture of bored indolence, of innocent preoccupation. It was almost too well done. Assured of a witness for the defense, he greeted the woman with a smile. "Why can't I do it?" he taunted. She ran close to him and laid her hands on his arm. Her eyes were fixed steadily on his. "Because," she whispered, "the man who shot that girl is your brother-in-law, Ham Cutler." For what seemed a long time Wharton stood looking down into the eyes of the woman, and the eyes never faltered. Later he recalled that in the sudden silence many noises disturbed the lazy hush of the Indian summer afternoon, the rush of a motor car on the Boston